Yo, my name is Mubarak, and this is En Masse.
We don't want a piece of the settler pie. We want the settler pie to be thrown in the garbage.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that there are people.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of En Masse. Today we're going to be having a discussion about settler colonialism and Canada. Interestingly, Canada does a great job of hiding and obscuring its role in regards to being a settler colonial and imperialist state. One of the ways it does this is by purporting that it is somehow not the United States or not like the United States, which is its southern neighbor. It presents itself as a wonderful and beautiful mosaic that's full of diversity and void of racism. In reality, just like the United States, Canada has had a long history of slavery, white supremacy, and the ongoing attempt to exterminate and displace Indigenous people. With all of that in mind, for today's episode, we'll be having a discussion with Alex and Brendan, who are both Indigenous Maoists and supporters of the PCR-RCP, or the Revolutionary Communist Party in Canada. Alex is a Métis woman who has done a lot of revolutionary student organizing with the Revolutionary Student Movement, and Brandon is of the Anishinaabe Bear Clan and does anti-fascist work as well as work with anti-colonial action, as well as being involved in some student organizing in Ottawa. For my first question, I asked Brendan and Alex about their personal experiences growing up under settler colonial rule and what effect that has had on them as individuals.
Well, there's like the regular everyday stuff of like checking government forms and knowing from a young age that you're being purposely separated into a population that's categorized under the state. And growing up like knowing that you aren't white, even though like I'm a person who appears white to people who meet me, but having that like white supremacy and settlerism revealed to you in interpersonal interactions was like really something interesting that you never get used to. So I'm thinking here, for example, of when I was living in the Occupy camp, Occupy Ottawa. I had an interaction with a settler where he didn't realize he was talking to a Métis person. He was going on and on about how great colonization was, how it brought so many wonderful things to First Nations people, Métis people, etc. And I pointed out to him, I was feeling brave, and I said, "Hey, I'm Métis, like fuck you." And his response was, "Oh no, you should be grateful. You speak English.
Wow.
You have all these wonderful educational things," and stuff like that. Really, the feeling that it causes is something that a settler will never experience in the same way. And then, the biggest thing for me growing up Métis was the fact that my dad died at a very young, when I was very young. So I was about 6 years old when my dad committed suicide. And at the time, it was just sort of this shitty thing that happened. But as I got older and started learning about the reasons behind why things like that are systemic issues and not just issues of individual people, that's when it really started to sink in that this is a problem of colonialism. 13.3% of Métis men between the ages of 20 and 59 report suicidal ideation. That is not a coincidence. Yeah, it's a very well calculated thing when your existence is always under attack. It's very easy to slip into a depressed state. There's a reason suicide is seen as a sort of spiritual psychosis as much as a mental illness in the Indigenous community.
And what would you say would make the perspective of someone who's Métis different from someone who was, say, Inuit or First Nations?
Yeah, this is a question that is kind of strange because it's like there's so much we have in common, and then there's things that are slightly different. Again, things we have in common, I think, is an understanding of the way that organized religion has played a role in colonization in Canada. But for me, it was always kind of funny growing up Métis, and so you visit Métis relatives, and there's this like big emphasis on Catholicism and like Louis Riel and the Métis Nation, but this like really intense hatred of the Pope and and the church.
Weird contradiction.
Yeah, it's a very strange contradiction that I haven't come across in the same way in other First Nations communities, even though there are Christian First Nation people. And then also for me, like, I moved up north. I grew up in Temeagama, Anishinaabe territory, which is not my traditional territory. And so growing up as a white passing Métis person in land that isn't yours, but trying to seek an identity that's being digested at a faster rate by the Canadian government than other Indigenous identities was hard. And what I mean by digested at a faster rate is that Métis people historically have been more easily co-optable by the Canadian government because of the Francophone element. There's a real emphasis on the French side of the culture as opposed to the Cree or whatever it's being mixed with, usually Cree. And there's a way in which like white supremacy has inflected that process and really worked to separate Métis people from the rest of the Indigenous community. And it's resulted in a bunch of stuff, namely the like a feeling of superiority among Métis people, or like it's hard to explain. There's this idea that like if Canada is this like beautiful mosaic, right, then Métis-ness represents the best of that because we are settler and Indigenous.
Yep.
But I mean, I don't see it that way, and that's certainly not the way that most Métis people see it. What I see is a unique nation that is, as opposed to other Indigenous nations that have a pre-colonial history and rich traditions, we are born out of colonial trauma in a unique way.
I guess it probably goes back to my mother. Her and her family moved away from the reservation that my family's from and moved to the town over. After that, my mom moved down to southern Ontario where I was born, and we went to live in a very small military town that mostly consisted of white people. I didn't know very many other people of color or any other Native people in this town. I knew that they existed, I just didn't really know who they were. In my high school, I was one of a handful of people of color that I knew, and just that fact made it like I was always different. I was not white, basically. I was the one that was sort of left out. A lot of jokes would be like very racist joke, and a lot of them would be pointed at me or around me, and I would have to sort of go with it and pretend like those kind of things were okay, because if I were to speak out or be upset about that kind of stuff, there wouldn't be much backing that I would get, and I'd be sort of socially isolated from a lot of people and a lot of friends that I would have within grade school, younger age, and to high school. So that was pretty tough. It gives you sort of the feeling that you don't really like what's going on, and that you feel different and bad about yourself, and that like you don't want to be brown, you don't want to be Native or any of these kind of things, because like this is, as a kid, like this is why everyone's making fun of you. You just don't want to be made fun of, and you just want this to stop. And not knowing much, like you come to some pretty bad solutions, and some like self-hating sort of ideas come up into your head because of white supremacy. So that was pretty hard growing up like that. Like you used to get like bullied for being brown. People would try to fight you, and then it'd be all that great racism. One thing that really sticks out in my head is when I first went to my family's reservation. My family's reservation is an island, and when you go onto it, you notice very quickly that there's not really any paved roads. Most of them are dirt, Most of the place is pretty run down. The buildings, the houses are very underkept. You can just feel a lot of poverty in this area. There's an old rundown church that's been being used as a library and for old computers. And there's a helipad for when people get sick. They get sent off in a helicopter to the hospital. And this was sort of like a juxtaposition of the leadership's houses there, which were much nicer and much bigger, and they really stood out compared to the poverty around them. In the school season, seeing as the reserve didn't have any institutions of education on them, all the native kids that were going to go to school had to go to the town over and live with people that sign up to be able to house kids, to let them go to school and live with them during the school year. My grandparents actually did that, but just seeing and just for the fact that kids had to leave their families and have to leave their community to be able to go to school and possibly stay with strangers, if they're lucky, stay with relatives, that's a pretty big one.
I think that it's evident from both of their statements that living under settler colonial rule has some very negative effects on Indigenous people. Even from a mental health point of view, the statistics in regards to depression and suicide among Indigenous people are pretty daunting. Among the First Nations people, the rate of suicide and depression is 2 times that of the national average. I can also relate to the sense of feeling dominated and isolated while growing up as a Black person in Canada. These experiences are also a large reason as to why revolutionary politics are so vital in this day and age. With that in mind, I asked both of them why Marxism, Leninism, Maoism was particularly attractive to them.
I started off as a Leninist in high school. I was never attracted to anarchism. I'm not really sure why. Probably just the people I met and whatever, in a different life, it might have been different. But Maoism, when I was introduced to Maoism, it was like a bolt of lightning for me. And the reason being is because Maoism deals with the question of colonialism in a fundamentally different way than any of the previous iterations of Marxism. Now, this isn't to say that there isn't a continuity, because I think that people often forget the real contribution of Leninism to the question of oppressed nations.
Yeah.
But yeah, Maoism has this unique history of the Chinese experience in dealing with a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society. And if we look at the legacy that Maoism created for itself after that point historically, the majority of revolutions or revolutionary attempts that we've seen have been in countries that are a part of the periphery, right? They're almost all semi-colonial situations and dealing with indigenous elements. And for example, like Peru, so Sendero Luminoso, one of, this is a party that laid down a lot of the theory of what we consider like Maoism as Maoism.
Yeah.
This is a party that was dealing with an indigenous struggle as well. So, I think that it's kind of in the bones of Maoism. And you feel that when you read the theory and think about the experiences. And that was the main thing for me, is like when you read through Maoist text, you see things that are readily applicable to your own life. Not only because like a lot of the ideas that it's put forward are universal, and like Protected Peoples War, and I will argue that that's universal, but because Maoism also is an anti-revisionist tendency, right? So it gets rid of the dogmatism of Marxism, Leninism, it gets rid of the dogmatism of Trotskyism, and it really wants to be a sort of fluid, creative process of revolution.
And how would you say, for example, here in quote-unquote Canada, with, the parties that we have here, there's Trotskyist groups, ML groups, and all kinds of groups. But what, in terms of like the actual like programs that these parties put forth, like what would you say for example, like with like the Communist Party of Canada, which is kind of like an ML social democratic party, what would you say is your problem with those in particular?
I mean, I think the main problem with the programs of parties like the CPC or the CPCML is not necessarily that they don't have anything in them about colonization or decolonization, but that they don't go far enough. They haven't grasped the problem of what it means to actually like wage revolution in a settler colony, and so they come up with these. I think the line in the CPC program is a people's parliament, right? They consider these things to be democratic struggles instead of intertwined with the revolutionary process. And so what you end up with is a future vision of Canada as Canada, right? Whereas as a Maoist, I call for the complete destruction of Canada. We don't want a piece of the settler pie. We want the settler pie to be thrown in the garbage.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that there are people in the movement who realize that, and then obviously, programs are living documents. But I think for me, like so I'm a supporter of the PCRCP, and that's the only program that goes far enough. And there's still work to be done there. It needs to go farther, and we need to actually like do practice to properly understand the contours of those problems. But the problems of waging revolution in a settler colony with a population of Indigenous people who may not be fully on board with a socialist society, or parts of it maybe, it's a very mixed issue. But yeah, that's the only program that goes far enough. Almost all the other ones fall into the trap of legalism, I would say, a parliamentary or legalistic approach to rights. So they conceive of Indigenous people as having lost rights under the Canadian state, or the Canadian state not providing them rights, when really it's not the place of the Canadian state to provide those rights in the first place.
Yeah.
It has no authority over us, and will never rightfully have authority over us.
So I think with Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, the way that this appeals to at least myself as an Indigenous person is I think it gives solutions for the problems that we're facing. It allows us to have an actual strategy to bring about the end of colonialism. We can actually organize around issues of national liberation, and not just stop there, but be able to end all class exploitation and oppression. One of the big things with Marxism-Leninism is that if you look back at its history, the national liberation struggles that Marxism-Leninism was able to do in Africa and in Asia, and then what it influenced in North America and South America with groups like the Black Panther Party, the Chicano nationalist movements, and the American Indian movement, some parts of them. It just showed that colonized people around the world were able to be mobilized, and were mobilizing themselves to bring about the end of colonialism and against their national oppression that was taking place. And all across the world this was happening, and a lot of them were being successful for their time. I think though the limitations were pretty apparent after a while of Marxism-Leninism, especially once revisionism took hold in these ideas. A lot of these older, these national liberation struggles sort of fell subject to neocolonialism, and sort of became nationally oppressed once again through either neocolonialism or imperialism, having their comprador bourgeois, their ruling class within their societies, be able to sell out their nation. Marxism-Leninism, I think, the reason these kinds of things can happen is because it doesn't recognize class struggle under socialism, and how we have to continue struggling and making revolution to be able to bring about this new world. like, we're not going to end our national oppression or our class oppression just by waging our first initial anti-colonial or national liberation struggles. We need to continue that struggle, and we have to continue revolution, class-based revolution also, to be able to destroy as all the class-based contradictions in society without bringing an end to the class system and capitalism. We're never going to be truly liberated, even if we create that national liberation part. Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, to me, also shows a clear path of how we can make revolution in the society that we're living in right now. I think with anarchism, and one of the biggest downside that anarchism could have to colonized people is the rejection of national liberation and seeing all anti-colonialism or national liberation struggles as being like bourgeois struggles, and not seeing that really the struggle of nationally oppressed and colonized people, their nationalism is one against white supremacy and one bringing people that have been pushed so far down for so long up to human standards, and saying we're proud of ourselves. We're proud that we are humans. We are proud that we exist. We're not going to let white supremacy make us feel like less than anybody else on this planet anymore. And we're willing to say that, and we want a better world, and we're going to be able to build this better world. Of course, this is always put to internationalism and wanting to also build that, like I said, a better world for everybody, not just our specific group, but all people, and that's done by making revolution.
I think that they both make it clear that Marxism, Leninism, Maoism goes further than, say, anarchism or Marxism-Leninism for them, in that it contains the experience not only of the general national liberation of the past century, but also an indigenous element which was included in the Shining Path's experience. Now, we're probably going to have to do an episode specifically for understanding the successes and the errors of the Shining Path in the future, but that's something that's very important to think about. The Black Panthers, who adhered to the Mao Zedong thought, the limits of which was partially discussed in the first episode, also saw Black people as colonized people similar to indigenous people, and this was a crucial part of their analysis. To get into the specifics of the indigenous struggle as they pertain to the Canadian state, I asked them broadly how the Canadian state's relations with indigenous nations have been historically.
If I could sum it up in one word, I'd say digestion. Yeah, it's always been a relationship of destruction and consumption. But what does that mean concretely? So the establishment of the Canadian state is directly born out of the labor and lives lost of indigenous communities. Stemming as far back as the fur trade, like resource extraction and commerce in this country started on the land and on the backs of indigenous people, and that's been a constant trend throughout Canadian history. And I think it's important to recognize that Canada is a capitalist country, it's an imperialist country, it's a country founded on white supremacy and genocide. And so it can only ever be those things and reproduce those things. And I think how that's played out, there are a number of examples we can point to. You and I have talked about policing before. So in the late 1800s, the RCMP was created to put down the Red River Rebellion of the Métis people, and also to serve as an army of occupation in Manitoba. And of course, they played a role in residential schooling and a whole other bunch of stuff. That's not the sole reason for their creation, or their sole reason for their creation was not the Métis Rebellion, but it was certainly a major one. Mm-hmm. Just highlighting here that, obviously they were created to put down more than like the Cree Nation and other nations as well. But they've continued to serve this function as an army of occupation. in racialized and working class neighborhoods because, you know, they terrorize more than Indigenous people. They terrorize our Black and brown people in Canada as well as working class white people. But this relationship is sort of fundamental to how the relationship between the Canadian state and Indigenous people functions. It's one of occupation and extraction. Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of like Canadian capitalism in particular, and you know, and obviously, you know, there's that, I think, with indigeneity in, you know, on Turtle Island, there's that direct connection with the land, you know, culturally, but also, yeah, and it's just like, it makes sense, right? Like your whole existence in a sense has been, at least in the past, you know, few hundred years or so, has been based on literally being, you know, moved out of like where you've lived and being treated like children and, you know, either killed off or just pushed around. Mm-hmm. So how would you say that capitalism in particular has affected, you know, the Indigenous people and the environment? More specifically, capitalism.
Oh, no, that's a great question. So again, to just reference my family history briefly, so this is like from the very beginning, what the Canadian government did was they would offer Indigenous people and other settlers, poorer settlers, a piece of land if you cleared like so many acres, right? So you clear like 1,000 acres and you get a 2-acre plot, right? To have your farm and whatever else to have subsistence for your family. And so this was like the way that the Canadian state very early on made the land ready for capital and exploitation. And often what would happen, this is what happened to my family, was as soon as you cleared the land, you got shipped off to a different reserve and forcibly moved. So my family was moved across the Canadian-American border several times, sometimes by choice, sometimes not. And yeah, this is sort of how it started out. And this process of dispossession is continuing even now. We can see it with fracking efforts on the East Coast. You know, the Unistoten encampment is a good example of resistance to this kind of dispossession. But yeah, we have, and across the prairies and several other places, we have oil companies coming in, taking land that isn't theirs, destroying it, and offering up, you know, minimum wage jobs or slightly above minimum wage jobs to local people in order to sort of garner support. They say, hey, we're making jobs, we're doing a good thing, but they don't mention that oil runoff is, you know, going into the rivers, it's causing cancer in the fish and all the animals around, it's ruining hunting and fishing practices, and those same cancerous elements are making their way into the community and causing diseases and really serious medical conditions. And then the whole thing is just depressing, right? And it's contributing to a feeling of hopelessness for Indigenous people, and it's really horrible. Yeah. I mean, an important thing too is this like lack of clean water on reserves and in more isolated communities is also forcing an urbanization of First Nations, Indigenous, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So people can't get water on their reserve. You know, they're shipping in bottled water, which is extremely expensive and time-consuming and also not good for the environment. And, you know, these are people who can't have a clean glass of water, can't take a hot shower. So they move to the city, right, in search of work, clean water, better living standards, and they don't find it. For the most part, they find sexual violence, police violence, and a myriad of other social ills.
Colonialism's really destroyed a lot of our nations and our people and our social systems that existed here before colonization took place. Our languages have been tried to be wiped out. They're making a comeback now from Indigenous people relearning these. Our culture and our ideas and our way of life was really tried by Canada to be wiped out and to make us not a people or not a nation or not a group anymore. it's the effect really has been ongoing genocide, and one of the longest genocides in recent history. Canada continues to try to erase us, make sure that we no longer tries to solve their Indian problem that they've had since their inception. Canada wants to be seen as a legitimate state on its own land, but the existence of Indigenous people and Indigenous nations and our history and the history of how Canada has treated us really goes against the Canadian idea and what Canada is trying to say as this is Canada, this is our land, this is our history, we're a legitimate political force and a legitimate state here in North America, when the truth is no, that Canada is not legitimate and this isn't Canada, this isn't Canadian land. This was many different Indigenous nations' lands, and many of them still exist now, and many of them have national identities and still see themselves as the true people of this land. On the front of the environment, Canada's mostly its extraction of resources have been close to Indigenous territories or in Indigenous territories where Native people are living. A lot of the mining that's taking place for different resources that Canada wants, a lot of the oil extraction, a lot of the deforestation, and a lot of the pollution of the water is either directly on Indigenous land, right by Indigenous land, or is poisoning Indigenous people or drastically affecting the way that Indigenous people are living. It's causing a lot more sickness in Indigenous communities and a lot more illness, and has also brought in with it a lot more crime, poverty, and death. One of the big things with missing and murdered Indigenous women is when these industries come into Native communities, a lot of the times it's the women that face a lot of the exploitation and the abuse because of it.
Now, in recent years, the Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, has been pushing a campaign entitled Truth and Reconciliation, which is an attempt of the settler colonial Canadian state to quote-unquote reconcile or attempt to fix its quote-unquote mistakes that have inflicted pretty horrible things onto Indigenous communities. Some of these things include the history of what was called aggressive assimilation, wherein Indigenous children were forced to go to Canadian schools where they weren't allowed to speak their own languages and were indoctrinated with Canadian nationalism and Christianity. Not to mention that many children were physically or sexually harassed by their teachers or the clergy. Since the beginning of the government's attempts to reconcile these attempts at erasing Indigenous people, they've given a few Indigenous families some money and have been pretending to inquire into missing and murdered Indigenous women, all of which are things that are still occurring in either the same or slightly different ways. So I asked Brendan and Alex about Canada's attempts at reconciliation to hear their thoughts.
So yeah, I mean, I think I also want to just mention too, like the relationship between Indigenous people and police is like fundamentally part of this truth and reconciliation, because I think it's completely laughable that we can begin to talk about truth and reconciliation when, you know, murdered and missing Indigenous women are still going murdered and missing, and we've got, you know, multiple reports of police. I'm thinking a couple of years ago there was the police unit in northern Quebec that had been found to be coercing sexual favors out of Indigenous women in the community, and this was like a decade-long process of abuse. And then we have things like the Starlight Tours, which some people might know that term, others might not, but the Starlight Tours are a process that happened in the prairies in Saskatchewan and Manitoba mostly, but where you have people being picked up by the police, usually young Indigenous men, but Indigenous women as well, being picked up downtown for loitering or whatever, right? Just being Indigenous and standing. Mm-hmm. And then they would take them late at night outside of the city and drop them. and hope that they would die. Like that's it's not an exaggeration to say that they hoped that the process of that was that they would die, because a lot of the times, we're talking about good old prairie winters, minus 40, minus 50 weather, and they're dropping off people and leaving them for dead. And so, I think with these things still ongoing, and it's important to acknowledge that they're ongoing, I think truth and reconciliation is just not possible. But that doesn't mean that it's not like something. I think like those are both really nice words, right? I don't think that there can be reconciliation between Indigenous people and the Canadian state, but I think that there can be a non-antagonistic relationship between settlers and Indigenous people, and I think that the revolutionary movement is the place or the locus where that's going to happen. And there have been multiple problems with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in general, like the way it's set up. There have been multiple directors that have left, and people that have left the project saying, this isn't going the way it should be, and sort of throwing in the towel. The fact that you have like the RCMP reporting on whether or not the RCMP committed any wrongdoing when dealing with Indigenous people is just hilarious. You wouldn't it's just funny that people can have sort of jurisdiction over whether or not they themselves committed a crime. Again, just to go back to this idea of the revolutionary movement is where this reconciliation might actually have a chance. Is because I think that there are certain intersections at which the realities of Indigenous working class life and working class settler life actually do intersect, and we have a common goal and a common enemy, and that enemy is capitalism. Now, how we go about ending it might be different among those communities, or the end goal might be different. I think we'll probably talk in a little bit about the class composition of Indigenous communities, but so there's different players on the field, so to speak, but the goals are generally oriented the same way, and the same things that are causing problems in the Indigenous community, causing health problems, causing people to be incarcerated at an alarming rate, and these are things that are also affecting the white working class community.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting because there's also even like the way in which Indigenous children are disproportionately affected by like the children's aid services and things like that, where like you already have these communities that are dealing with so much like kind of historical trauma, and then that affects their lives, and then maybe someone has whatever kind of personal problems in their home, and then you send in some settler Catholic thinking like organization to like basically make a judgment and then like pull these kids out of these homes, and it's like, does that help in the long term? And I think it even helps to continue kind of like the assimilation process in a sense, right, where it's like you pull these kids out of the home and then you take them to settler schools, and you basically give them a settler perspective, and like basically try to like pry it out of them, like their indigeneity out of them, in a sense. So I think it's very telling.
It's the adoption and child protective services in Canada, the way it is functioning right now is basically a remolding of residential schooling. And I mean, it's a shame because there is a very real problem of continued trauma and generational trauma, and so we need to address that. But I think you're right to point out that removal from the community is not necessarily the way to go about that. There's healing that needs to happen for all the generations involved, and removing people from their cultural context from the entirety of their family is not going to solve those problems.
With Canada's recent attempts with the Truth and Reconciliation, the way that I see that Truth and Reconciliation is this is an attempt by Canada to finally close the lid on what's happened to Indigenous people and what continues to happen to Indigenous people through colonization and the colonial state right now. They want to be able to tie a nice, clean bow on it and say, we're finished here. We said our apologies. We showed what happened as best their ability, which is bullshit. And we paid out certain families money, and now we're all good. So Native people should just get over it. Though, really, that's the way that I take this Truth and Reconciliation. It's Canada trying to be able to give a half-assed apology and tell Native Americans or Indigenous people that we should just get over it because they've said sorry and there's nothing else to say here. I think the way that the dynamic has changed is Canada seems to be talking more about certain parts of these issues and letting certain groups of Native people be able to give some of their stories and be able to try to find some part of closure within that. A lot of the times, though, there is a lot of people that are left out, and any subversive stories or ideas that point to, hey, actually, no, you're still doing this, and this is going to continue to happen unless something is changed fundamentally with the state and with Canada. And as long as Canada exists here, these things will happen. Those kind of things are not allowed. Anything subversive to Canada or the state is something that's not going to be allowed and has not been really allowed. So the dynamic really is that Natives, that Canada is okay with being able to speak. They're being able to speak about the issues that their family and people have been able to face, but there's really no solution that's been able to be given. There's no moving forward besides an apology and maybe some money. It's really just a media spectacle, in my opinion.
I think that their opinions are telling in that Canada now sees itself as a finished project, and in doing so, it's now able to look back and say a few sorries, but it'll never go as far as delegitimizing itself as a thing that's fundamentally an imperialist, settler colonial project. And this isn't surprising given its unabashed support to American imperialism and Israel, which are also settler colonial imperialist states. A country that espouses to be a champion for human rights, while it propagates an ongoing racist genocide at home and abroad. For my next question, I wanted Alex and Brendan to elaborate on the reality that Indigenous people are not a people that have all the same political and/or class interests. Like any other society, there are contradictions within it that manifest themselves. Let's see what they have to say.
Yeah, so, I mean, like, I think right off the bat, it's worth pointing out that even everything I'm saying here, right, it should be put to judgment by people. I am a Métis person, but my experience differs very greatly from a Métis person who grew up in Manitoba, for example. It differs from a person who's small m Métis, so mixed settler and Indigenous, but not necessarily a part of the Red River sort of history. And then there's the fact that I am a Maoist, right? So I have a very particular political opinion, and while I think that that's the way forward for the Métis Nation and for most of the populations living in the confines of Canada right now, that's not an opinion that all Indigenous people share. There's different national concerns, right? We often forget that when we are using the terms First Nation, we're already homogenizing in a way that the government wants us to. That, you know, someone who's Haudenosaunee is going to have very different concerns from someone who's Inuit or someone who's Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. So there's that, and I mean, we could spend days talking about the, you know, needs and particularities of each of those nations, and then even beyond that on the class level. So there's class war exists everywhere. Class struggle is happening everywhere, and it's happening on reserves and in Indigenous communities as much as it's happening other places. So You have working class Indigenous people, you have lumpen proletarian Indigenous people, you have comprador, national bourgeois Indigenous people. So there is sometimes a contradiction between the national bourgeoisie, which sometimes coincides with the band council, and I'll talk about band councils in a second. But so an example I can think of is, I can't remember the name of the reserve, but there was a situation wherein the council agreed to have a fracking operation come in and none of the citizens were of the reserve were down for this, so there were like massive protests and blockades. And but yeah, this is a very clear example of, right, there's a commercial viewpoint that was being upheld by the band council that was not respected or wanted by the people in the community, and so there's a very strict divide, and that divide falls in that case along class lines. The people who are working in the community or just trying to exist in the community because jobs might not be available, and the people who are looking for money for national infrastructure to be built up. But the issue is that it's not actually national infrastructure because it's not owned by us, it's not operated by us. So yeah, there's class divides in that sense. And going back to the band councils, so an important thing to remember about the band council system is that it's an implanted system, right? So it's something where the Canadian government came in under the Indian Act and other pieces of legislation and said the hereditary chief system is no longer valid, and basically forcibly put in an electoral chief system. Now, we can talk about whether or not the systems that existed previous to the elected band council system were actually democratic or non-patriarchal. I think it differs from nation to nation and community to community, but bottom line, the band council system is a vestige of colonialism, an ongoing vestige of colonialism. So it has a class character to it. It has, I think, a fundamentally bourgeois class character to it. And it will continue to do so long as we don't have full control over that democratic process.
What would you say are some of the revolutionary elements among the Indigenous community?
Well, I think, you can't open a newspaper or go online or even step foot out in your community today without seeing Indigenous people struggle and, speak up against capitalism and colonialism. And this is not a new thing. I think it's just started to get media attention in a different way than it has in the past, because this is 270 plus year struggle that's happening. So I think the revolutionary element is self-evident. When I'll reference Una Stoughton, when I look at something like that that's reclaiming land in a militant manner, I think this is great. This is something that we're going to see during People's War, right? And I think that's something that's really important to remember, is a lot of the militant struggles that are occurring, the blockades, parts of the Idle No More movement, things like this, are things that we can learn from as revolutionaries. They're things that are going to become tactical and strategic elements of the revolution, and that a revolution in Canada is going to be worse off without the accompaniment of those skills and the participation of Indigenous people. I think for the most part, when we see these struggles erupting, it is working class Indigenous people. Sometimes it's national bourgeois elements, so people who own businesses in the Indigenous community who do have a vested interest in capitalism, but don't necessarily want a settler colonial system hampering their version of capitalism. So I think that there are ways that we can work with those people for the time being, because our goal is the end of settler colonialism, and it may even be the end of capitalism for some national bourgeois elements who want to return to a more traditionalist system.
So a lot of the times, Indigenous activists, white activists, Indigenous people and white people and people in general, a lot of times they'll think that a lot of Native people all have the same interests and all want the same thing, and that our representatives are in the AFN are the representatives of all Indigenous people, or they are able to put our interests first. And this really goes against how a class system works and how our interests actually differ from each other. With the AFN or other members of almost a bureaucratic ruling class, or like the more well-off comprador classes within Indigenous society, is they get paid to be able to work within this colonial state. They make money off of working with Canada and having Canadian interests at heart, and being able to put an Indigenous spin on what the Canadian policies and ideas towards Indigenous people, and really give Native people a false outlet to be able to go and put their political beliefs and organizing skills into, that fundamentally don't challenge Canada or build a revolutionary movement in it. A lot of these comprador bourgeois elements are doing it for personal gain and to be able to live much better than the rest of their people. Of course, there's always some people that truly believe that they are doing better for Indigenous people and are trying to make a better life for the people here. But really, I think that's just part of the Canadian ideological state being able to really reinforce the Canadian ideas and the Canadian state as something that isn't just something terrible for our people, and fooling some Indigenous people into thinking that they can actually make a change within this system. Though there's elements and sections in the Indigenous societies that are comprador and are going against what Indigenous people's interests are, especially Indigenous working class people and the most oppressed within our society. There's also been a lot of Indigenous spirits of liberation and a lot of will to struggle against Canada. We can just look at the different struggles that have taken place against construction and against pipelines and against a resource extraction on Indigenous lands. Indigenous people going out against the interests of the Canadian state and blocking them because they will hurt and kill Native people in their communities. This directly goes against what Canada wants, but still people and organizers within those communities come together to be able to try to make a difference there. One of the biggest ones that have happened and that almost everybody knows about in Canada is the Oka crisis, when the town of Oka, just out of Quebec, Montreal, was going to build a new golf course on top of Mohawk land, and warriors took up arms against this town and barricaded it off and occupied these areas and didn't let them be able to build anything on their land until the military came in and an armed standoff took place. This is really a great spirit of an Indigenous resistance, and this is something that we really have to uphold and continue on with.
To elaborate more on this idea of homogenizing and simplifying the experiences of Indigenous people, I wanted to explore on this idea of the quote-unquote noble savage that is often evoked when speaking of Indigenous people. So I asked them what the significance of that notion is when we're talking about indigeneity.
The notion of a noble savage is when we're looking at like Indigenous people or a group or a race or a nation, it's really savage, meaning not civilized, below European, what Europeans see as a civilized group of people. And the noble part is really them trying to say that like we might not all be civilized and smart, but our heart is in the right place sort of idea. And a lot of this really goes against and misunderstands the great achievements that Indigenous society was able to produce before colonization, and the long history we've had in this land, and how we are able to conquer nature and bend it to our will to best fit what's going on in our world, and to be able to build up great civilizations and societies and cities and trade networks all across the Americas and new technologies. It really pushes all that to the side and tries to paint a picture of as Indigenous people as one sort of hunting, gathering, living in small tents sort of people that are one with the land and everything's great and there's not really conflict and stuff like that, when really that wasn't the case. We were the masters of our world. We were able to build up great nations, and we were able to build up trade networks, and we fought each other. We had different interests. Other nations had interests that were different to, say, their neighboring ones. It was just like every human civilization.
I think that the complicated aspect of being a person that's colonized is having to deal with the contradiction of having white supremacy attempting to erase the history of your people or nation, meanwhile, on the other end, having to fight colonization in the present towards a different outcome in the future. One thing that happens a lot, and I've seen this in the African and Black community, is when we focus so much on searching for our past history that the crux of our decolonization is centered around unearthing what white supremacy has hidden from us. For me personally, I think that it's important to know that we also had our own civilizations that were complex and that contributed to world history. But I don't think that this should mean that we idealize that which existed in the past in an attempt to go back to what was, instead of realizing that we're in a completely new situation and that we have to move forward. I asked Brendan and Alex about this to get their thoughts from an Indigenous perspective.
Yeah, it definitely exists. Some people refer to it as traditionalism. I think it's probably more complicated than that, but traditionalism definitely has a role to play. A really popular term that gets thrown around right now in academia and in some Indigenous activist circles, but not all, is the pre-colonial mind. So this idea that there's a pre-colonial mind that we can access, that's tangible to us, and we have to get back to that. Now, what I'm about to say is going to get contentious because so a lot of Indigenous cultures do not have a linear conception of time. And so historical materialism, which is the viewpoint that I'm working from, sometimes, not always, I would argue, comes into conflict with that. Because if you don't have a linear conception of time, then it makes sense that you can reach back in certain ways or spiritually access things through physical experience like food or cultural tradition, ceremony, things like that. I think those things are possible, that it's possible to get back elements of our culture and our feeling as a community together, but I also am a proponent of historical materialism. So I think that what colonization has done is not necessarily, it's not as if we're going to be unable to move past it, but it's not like we can just wipe the slate clean. It didn't happen. Because I'm a proponent of historical materialism, there's a feeling that we can't necessarily get rid of what happened in colonization, even if we are able to move past it. So there's real tangible effects that colonization has had on people, and we need to address those and deal with those social realities. So in terms of like looking back to a pre-colonial mind or something, I'm more concerned of looking forward to the future and getting out of the current problems that we're in now. Yeah, it's Fanon, he says in Wretched of the Earth, he says we should not therefore be content to delve into the people's past to find concrete examples to counter colonialism's endeavors to distort and depreciate national culture as the collective thought process of a people to describe, justify, and extol the actions whereby they have joined forces and remained strong. So to simply reach back to a pre-colonial mind and not deal with, or not even not deal, but just disregard how we've grown as nations during colonization, is not only to sort of flippantly move past a lot of that trauma, but it also doesn't acknowledge this like really brilliant process of resurgence that the Indigenous community has undergone. The fact that we are still here and the Canadian government has not managed to kill us off is a wonderful thing that should be celebrated. And I think to simply go back doesn't give that its proper place in our history. Yeah,
and I think it obscures the reality that people, and I think it's kind of this like kind of static understanding of what like a culture is or like an identity is, where like people do this thing where like Indigenous culture was like this and it was like this since the beginning of time, and then colonization came in and fucked it up. But I think it's a lot more complicated. I'm sure if you looked at Indigenous communities when they first were first creating their culture, it was probably very different from what it looked like right before colonization or something like that. So people are always changing and splitting off, and new ideas come in, new traditions. So I think it's important for us to see that and like understand that based on what we have now, we have to take some things from the past, sure, but also sift through it, like what works, what doesn't work, things like that.
Yeah, and there's things that we've gained from growing together as a community too. So for example, like the term Two-Spirit, right, is a relatively new term. I think early 90s, mid 90s, I can't remember, but it was established by like a Pan-Indian conference. So this is a term that has a different meaning depending on the nation, because nations had different perspectives on gender and sexuality and these things, and it's sometimes combined gender and sexuality, a sexual expression, sometimes it's not. But that's a really progressive, fruitful term that has grown out of this need for us to band together and to sort of keep our cultures alive. And it's important to acknowledge those things, because a lot of the pre-colonial mind stuff, there are certain aspects that we shouldn't want to return to, right? Not all nations were matriarchal. I don't think that, I should have to wear a skirt in ceremony if I don't want to wear a skirt in ceremony, if that's not part of my gender expression, even as a woman, and so there are things that we need to move past and modernize for ourselves. But I think the important thing to remember here is we need to do those things apart from settler meddling, so to speak, because this is not simply a defense of all of the wonderful things that modernization has brought us, but rather an acknowledgement that we take the good with the bad.
A lot of people, when we're talking about anti-colonialism or decolonization or national liberation, whatever word that we want to use for this, do see that decolonization or anti-colonialism as a reversal back to a way things were, and that this way of things that is no longer present is the superior and better way of existence. Fundamentally, I think this doesn't really grasp what colonialism has done and how it's changed us as a people and us as nations. Colonialism has fundamentally changed our history and changed us moving forward and who we are as nations and peoples now. It's left a massive scar that we're never going to be able to get rid of now, this scar. It's shaped us now, and we really can't revert back or should want to really go back to a past mode of production or society. What we want to be doing is moving forward and being able to forge a new revolutionary society, one based on our struggle against colonialism and genocide and for the liberation of our people and all oppressed peoples across the world from national oppression and class oppression. We need to be looking forward and building a new society and a better one, not looking back and trying to see with rose-tinted glasses a way that's no longer there and pretend that this was somehow a perfect paradise. I think a lot of the times that this just sort of plays into the sort of white settler narrative of noble savagery, that everything was great in harmony with nature and blah, 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 when like this wasn't 100% the case. Indigenous society, just like all society, had contradictions within it. It had fighting, and it was complicated. Life then was also complicated, and there were struggles to take place then. It wasn't this wonderland that a lot of people make it out to be. But on that note, yeah, it was great in the sense that there was no colonialism and there was no genocide taking place from Europeans, and they weren't stealing our land. Like, yeah, that's the part that I would like, but that's the part that we're also forging forward with to end colonialism and end that theft and genocide. And the only way we can do that is by moving forward and not trying to go back.
Sometimes people see, like, you know, communism or like revolutionary communism as like a foreign agent that's coming into, let's say, you know, indigenous communities. This happens also like in the African community sometimes too. And, you know, they kind of take that and in doing so kind of reject their own, you know, reject it for their own national liberation or any form of liberation. Is this correct? And if not, why do you think it's incorrect?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've mentioned before sort of the universal aspects of Maoism and Marxism, and I think that that's really important to remember, that Marxism is a science, and what we mean by that is not that it is some capital S dogma that we have to follow absolutely, but that it's a process of discovery. Marxism is a way for us to come to know the world, not to determine what the world is. And so when I think about whether or not it fits here, I think, like, I don't know, it almost seems counterintuitive to me. Like, we have a process of coming to know the land and ways of being in the world, and Marxism seems to me a fundamental part of that. And then there's also the fact that, I don't know, throughout my life, I've come to know parts of my culture and seen the parallels between these things and Marxism. I'll use an example that's more specific to the land that we're on right now, because we're recording in Hamilton, so it's Haudenosaunee territory. This is part of the Dish with One Spoon agreement, right? Which some people might be familiar with. So it's the idea that there's this bountiful tract of land that multiple nations have access to, and there's this agreement to share in the wealth and commune with each other in a way that's non-antagonistic, and that seems like a fundamentally communist idea to me. I think that you can see this in a lot of traditional ways of being, not all of them, of course, and there's contradictions still, but I think that a lot of the good stuff is there. And then, I mean, if all of that wasn't enough, we also have the long history of Maoism and Marxism participating in national struggles, of, you know, holding up oppressed nations. I mentioned this before, like, the majority of the world revolutions have taken place in countries that are not a part of the, you know, the center of capital. They're nations that are on the periphery. They're nations with colonial pasts, with who have suffered under imperialism. So it just seems that, yeah, in the bones of Marxism, it's in the sort of underpinning of it is this rejection of colonial authority. It's a rejection of any form of exploitation and oppression. And yeah, that doesn't seem foreign to our struggles. So
yeah, and it's like, even if you kind of think about it in a way, like, kind of like the I don't know, kind of classic understanding of what communism was mostly reflected in places like, I'm pretty sure, I forget the name of I think he was like an anthropologist that I think even Marx studied this person, and he like looked at like the Inuit communities here as an understanding of a sort of communism. So I think, yeah, it's like it's there already in some respects, and I think it's actually those communities, like those indigenous communities, or even a lot of African communities. Sometimes this is mixed in with like a semi-feudal aspect and things of like that. But the communist aspects are usually there in terms of like, not as much of a disparity between like, the way people's lives are, like an idea of like communalism and sharing and like, just basic things,
Yeah, the classic one that gets pulled out in the Canadian context is the potlatch, right? Like this idea of redistributing wealth. I think often these like sort of mythic tales of primitive communism or whatever we want to call it, can sometimes play into the noble savage idea or this idea of a pre-colonial mind. But I think what is important to take from them is that at the base level, like all societies in human history have started off as cooperative enterprises, right? And exploitation and systems of domination and whatever have entered into the fold with the development of different social formations, feudalism being one, capitalism being another, and that I think that these things are the things that are counterintuitive to the way we live as human beings. And that there can still be differences in the way that communism is carried out among, or in different cultural situations or different national contexts. But yeah, cooperation and an aversion to exploitation is key to human nature.
Yeah, and I always tell people this, where it's like, humans existed for like, I don't know, tens of thousands of years, like in more of a communal situation. Versus and so like all this idea of like class differentiation and things like that are actually fairly recent, and it's like, I don't know, less than 10% of our entire existence on this earth is like capitalism and feudalism, slavery, things like that. They're very new, and they only came with like, there's some technological aspects to that, but it's like, yeah, it's like fundamentally we were created, and this is why we're such social beings in a sense, and why we were able to like evolve the way we did was because of that, fundamental aspect of like sharing or communalism or whatever you want to call it, but
well, and people forget too that we're free agents, right? And so like when I use a phrase like human nature, I'm not using that because I think that there is such a thing as like a fundamental core human nature that's like we can't overcome it in any circumstance. I'm using it because it's an easy phrase to describe the things that I think are most common in our history. But yeah, we created capitalism and we can destroy it. We just got to figure out how.
Yeah, and if we don't, it's like it'll destroy us. So yeah.
Some people do see communism, revolutionary communism, Maoism, and all these ideas as somehow foreign or European ideas. That's pretty much a dominant sort of thought, especially from universities and people like that. Really saying that an idea like a stateless and classless society and how to get there is somehow European is like saying the laws of gravity are European and don't apply here because a European person thought of them. Just because somebody in Europe or a different land wrote these down doesn't make them European, in my opinion. Like, gravity isn't just European because a European person wrote them. We can see the effects of gravity in our everyday lives right now, and we can see and those effects of gravity were apparent to pre-colonial societies also. Gravity still existed before colonization existed. The same can be said for class struggle and class societies. Like, before colonization, there was contradictions and struggles between different classes that existed within the societies that they existed in. Right now, for Indigenous people, we can see a class struggle take place against Indigenous working people and their comprador bourgeois elements, and Indigenous people, like the working Indigenous people, against Canada's settler colonial and capitalist state, and how the interests are different, and how how our labor power and us as people are being exploited, and how our lands are being exploited for capitalist profits. It also really does push aside a lot of the anti-colonial struggles that took place across the world that were either directly communist or influenced by communism and communist revolutionaries. In a lot of them in Africa, like the struggles in Mozambique and Angola, Vietnam, and ones in Asia like Vietnam, Korea, China, right now happening in the Philippines, in South America and Central America with Cuba, and the influence that it played on colonized people within America and Canada, with the Black Panther Party, the Chicano nationalist movement, parts of AIM, all these different national liberation organizations and parties that were directly communist or influenced by communism, that was able to liberate millions of people and change the world, in my opinion.
Okay, now moving away from the past towards the present and future, I wanted to know their thoughts when it comes to the relationship between immigrant communities that moved to settler colonial Canada and the Indigenous communities living under settler colonial rule.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of common suffering between Indigenous people and people who immigrate to Canada in terms of urbanization, impoverished city sections, underfunded schools, you name it, lack of cultural programming. These are all things that the immigrant and the Indigenous community have in common. And it's, especially vile in a context where Canada claims to be this accepting, tolerant place where you can, be whoever you were going to be culturally, but just in Canada. And it's just a total lie. I think the Canadian government has done a very good job of making solidarity between immigrant populations and Indigenous people difficult. Again, this process of urbanization, of squabbling over housing, right? Yeah. There's not enough housing in this country, and that it becomes difficult when you have an immigrant population moving into an urban area that was typically inhabited by Indigenous people who are being pushed out because they can't afford to live there. And, you have immigrant people coming in and setting up shop, and contradictions arise, right?
Yeah.
I do think these things are we're going to be able to overcome them. There needs to be solidarity. It's not unresolvable by any means, but this is going to depend on a myriad of factors, first of which is recognizing the common problem, right? Which is it's not the issue of some immigrant came and took my housing opportunity. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. What the real issue is that there's not enough housing, there's not enough jobs, there's not enough social programming, whatever, and the government is not able or willing to provide it. It's not simply a matter of funding or whatever. It is also an ideological issue and an issue of white supremacy.
Yeah.
And the creation of this ongoing creation of an underclass in this country. So yeah, I think that the antagonism is resolvable. But yeah, it's like anything else. It has to be done on a nation to nation basis, and as long as Indigenous people are not empowered to act in such a way as nations with equal rights and on a level playing field, that contradiction is going to continue to exist and be exacerbated by that unevenness and also by the presence of the Canadian state.
Mm-hmm. And I think even the education system does a good job of basically erasing the existence of
Yeah.
like indigenous people, where, and maybe I think now maybe in the education system, like they teach kids a little bit, like very little tiny smidget of like information about indigenous communities. But if you're like an immigrant that's, let's say you're 40 years old and you come here, a lot of people come here, they have no idea there's
Yeah.
even an indigenous population, which says a lot about, what people are watching on TV and what they're learning in their, ESL classes or whatever it is, so I think it's telling, yeah.
Yeah, no, because it's only included in the citizenship testing and whatever those courses. It's only included as a part of the history, right? So Indigenous people are constantly being pushed into the past as some like thing that doesn't exist anymore,
Exactly.
right? And we're constantly erased, and so you can't really blame immigrant people for coming here and having the illusion that there aren't any Indigenous people left or that we are fully assimilated. And then even further than that, like, yeah, the education system varies so greatly depending on where you are in the country. And I think like a lot of, most immigration is going to major urban centers like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, right? These places. And I remember for me, like one of the really stark realities moving south from Northern Ontario was that there is no education down here about colonialism. So up north, it's kind of an unavoidable topic. And I was lucky to go to a school that actually had okay Indigenous programming. It wasn't great. It could have been improved, but we actually learned about residential schools in grade 10 history, right? And I remember when I went to university, I was sitting in class and the professor would ask questions about like, okay, who knows about residential schools? And I was the only person in a 100-person class that would put up my hand, or it'd be like me and one other Native person, like lock eyes across the room. You have this moment of recognition. But yeah, it's just appalling. It's appalling that people don't know what was happening in their own backyard. Like, it's
Pretty bad.
it's nuts.
The relation with Indigenous people and immigrants, especially refugees, is sort of an interesting one to me. With my organizing in Ottawa, with our anti-fascist struggle, I've been seeing that the far right, white nationalists and white supremacists, have been also trying to reach out to Indigenous people to try to unite the white supremacists with Native people. Their point being that they're going to play this. They're going to play the Native people to say, hey, you guys don't want any more settlers on your land, right? These refugees, they're going to be settlers. They're going to come into your land, take more of it away from you, and you're going to continuously have less. So we don't like those refugees, and we don't want them coming here and taking more of your land. So we need to unite and kick out these refugees. They really try to up that as the main thing to be able to push out their, a lot of times, Islamophobic and xenophobic ideas. So they've been really trying hard to push that kind of propaganda against refugees to the Native population here. And personally, I've seen a few people fall for it, but after having discussions with these people about what these other groups that they're going out to support actually think, a lot of the times they can see the parallels with the refugees, and they don't really want anything to do with those groups afterwards. A lot of times when we're talking about these issues with refugees, I remind other Indigenous people that the same powers that have destroyed our lands and destroyed our nations, that took away everything that we have, are the ones that are destroying the lands that these refugees are coming from. They're the same forces that are destroying these refugees nations, and these same forces are the reason why that these people have to leave their homes in fear to come to Canada. And a lot of that is, these forces are Canada, this force is America, this force is imperialism and the capitalist world system that's doing this. They're destroying these people's nations, and similarly, just like they destroyed our nations, and we have a lot more in common with these people and their struggle, a lot more in common with colonialism and imperialism, fighting against those things, than we do with any of these white supremacists, any of these ultra-nationalists, any of these people that support the Canadian state as the sovereign state over all of our lands. And these are not people that we need to push away or not support. These are people that we need to show solidarity with, because we would hope that these people show solidarity with us and can see how our struggles are so close to each other.
How would you say like idea of like postmodernism and identity politics has affected or obscured the Indigenous struggle? And what are some of these views, and are they useful in regards to Indigenous liberation or not? And like, what role does tokenization have there?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to, because I think identity politics has become sort of a fucking sort of a dog whistle of kinds. But yeah, so I would like to start out by like separating identity politics, or what I'm going to be referring to as identity politics, from sort of traditional identity politics, which comes out of, you know, feminism in the 80s and 90s and intersectionality, because I think in like sort of the mainstream consciousness, that form of identity politics, which may have had a progressive bent to it, or could have been productive in some way in terms of talking about the different aspects of a person and how they relate to each other, has been replaced by this neoliberal individualist version of identity politics, which is really focused on essentialism and perspective of the individual rather than perspective of the community, or the way in which different aspects of life come to be in a person, right? And result in a unique viewpoint. So essentialism, I think, is the main problem. If I had to boil it down, I think identity, you know, as identity politics is an incoherent way of identifying oppression, because it presupposes two things. So one, that someone must identify with their their oppression as a defining feature of themselves. So that, you know, do I wake up every morning and go, yeah, I feel really fucking Métis today? No, I don't. I wake up and I, you know, complain that there's no milk in the fridge or whatever, right? I go about my day. And two, that oppression and privileges are inherent to certain people, cultures, and races, regardless of other relative relationships and systems, such as capitalism. So, like, yeah, it's like if someone looks at me, they see a white passing Métis person. So I do have some like white passing privilege, but there are all these other things that are affecting how I go about the world, right? And it's not just a matter of how I am identifying. The state is doing the identifying for me. The people that I'm interacting with are doing the social reading, so to speak. And this shouldn't be a difficult thing for people to come to realize, considering for the most part we understand that things like race are constructed, right? It's not to say that like people don't physically have different skin colors, but the way that those races are perceived, the mythos around them, the stigma, what have you, is created. And so it turns it into this essentialization where and honestly, like in the activist crowd, has made it a lot easier for tokenization to occur, because it becomes this thing of like, well, you know, we'll have Alex talk because she's a Métis woman, so she has X perspective. And like, yeah, I think that's good. I'm happy to do those things.
Partially true, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also the case that, you know, as I've mentioned previously before, I'm a Métis Maoist, right? So my opinion doesn't stand in for the entirety of the Métis community, and it certainly doesn't stand in for the entirety of the Indigenous community in Canada. And I may even have differences, you know, I love talking to other Indigenous Maoists, but it's not as if we don't have differences of opinions. So yeah, there's this weird essentialization that because we have a shared experience of colonization, that we should then have a shared political perspective. And sometimes that's true, right? We can talk about like systemic things versus individual things, but it's not always true, and somebody shouldn't be taken at their word just because of a cultural affiliation, right? Like I don't trust Perry Bellegarde, the head chief of the AFN, when he shills for the Liberal Party, and that's not because we don't have a shared Indigenous perspective. It's because I disagree with him politically, and so there's only so far that understanding identity can get us. And I'm more interested in looking at how power relationships work, and identity can be an aspect of that, but it's
not the sole.
It's not the sole locus of that power.
Yeah, it focuses so much on the individual that, it comes to these conclusions. And I think that with the Indigenous struggle, it kind of culminates in this idea of like decolonizing your mind, where I've heard this so much, where it's like, oh, decolonize your mind, your mind, your mind. But then it's like, why is it just the mind? What about the actual physical realm of existence that people live in, And sure, that's, in a sense, that's a stage, of like, thinking through, the oppression and things like that are happening around us. But I feel like they treat it as an end goal as opposed to like just a part of the process of understanding struggle, but
yeah, it's this liberal idea that you can manifest things into reality on a basis of how we view things or what rights exist, and it's just untrue. And anyone who has ever suffered under a very authoritative situation or a colonial state of any kind will tell you that you can't just like will decolonization into existence. But yeah, I do think like decolonizing the way we think is important, in the same way that like as Marxists we strive to have a proletarian outlook. We should strive to have a decolonized outlook, and that's of course a part of it, but that goes hand in hand with real political practice, and avoids this fetishization of the individual's own feelings, right? When I make a political decision, I do so not based on my own personal preference or my subjective outlook, or at least I try for the most part not to. I make it based on what, is a commonly held view, what is going to do the most good for the most amount of people, what's going to be effective, right? And yeah, again, this fetishization of oppressed standpoints, like with Oprah or whatever, having me speak at rallies or other people speak at rallies is really... it's really damaging. It makes it so that you can't, it's hard to know who your comrades are. And it also makes it so that any attempt to actually involve people from these oppressed groups is sort of an empty gesture. And I've been really lucky and really blessed in my experiences that hasn't been the case, but I definitely see tokenization happening through the left. And I think like the key element of difference for me is that when I go and speak at a rally, I'm doing so, as a part of something greater than myself, but also I have agency over what I'm saying and how I'm doing it. And I think people forget too that like just a lack of agency isn't proof of tokenization. That tokenization, we can be complicit in our own tokenization, for sure. Right? And it's a tricky line to walk.
Yeah.
With postmodernism, one of the biggest things that bugs me the most is identity politics and postmodernism infantilizes Indigenous people, infantilizes colonized or nationally oppressed people also. It says that things are really tough for us, and if we organize or if we take militant action, or if anybody takes militant action with us, that we are going to face the brunt of whatever bad things happen. So we can never be militant, and we can never actually try to make a change because bad things will happen to us and life will be hard. Well, in reality, genocide's already taking place and is continuing to take place. We already live a very difficult life, one filled with police brutality and oppression based off of us being Indigenous. The way that we change this isn't by going to sit on some panel discussion to be able to talk about some ideas of decolonial thought or whatever the case might be. The way that we do this is by going into the streets and going to where the masses and where the people are, and to be able to build a militant revolutionary struggle that can actually make a change and bring about an end to this system. And yes, it's going to be tough, And yes, people are going to get hurt, and yes, it's going to be a struggle. But if we're serious about making a change, we have to be serious to put our lives on the line for the people and for our struggle to build a better world and a world free from class and national oppression. This isn't going to take place if we just sit on our asses and do nothing and complain the whole time about how it's too dangerous for us to do things. Our lives are dangerous. We have to do this if we want to bring an end to that danger that our people face. And really, postmodernism really dulls our blade and makes us declaws us as a movement and really takes away everything that's effective for our struggle against capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. And postmodernism and identity politics are something that we should be seen as an enemy to the people and an enemy against our revolutionary struggle. We need to struggle against it just as much as we need to struggle against any incorrect ideas, and we need to prove that our ideas are the correct ones. And the only way we do that is through organizing and through practice and building up that movement.
So this is a bit of the idealist question that I have, but in terms of like, you know, a post-revolutionary situation, like what would something like that look like? And let's say there was a socialist or communist revolution, what, you know, in terms of like where indigenous people stand, what do you think should happen? And you know, we're kind of talking in the air, but I think it's important to think about a little bit, you know, even if we don't fully know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned before there are different like national interests among indigenous nations, and there's obviously a push from settler parties to not just be, you know, sent back to Europe or whatever. So it's one of these things where it's really difficult because I don't think. And again, this might be contentious for some people, but I don't think the displacement of the entire settler population is going to be a good thing necessarily. But I do think that we do need to move towards a social formation or a national formation of some kind that is not just indigenous nations being recognized under a settler state, which is, again, as I've mentioned, a lot of the Marxist programs that exist in Canada, with the exception of the PCRCP, in my opinion, put that forward. I don't think that it's possible to come to a strict conclusion about how this is going to happen, because this process is going to require, nation-to-nation contact between settler parties and indigenous nations, and agreement on a revolutionary program and militant action, which is, starting to happen in very, very small ways, but there's still a lot of terrain to cover. And then it's also going to require nation-to-nation discussion between indigenous nations. So, for example, like if we're talking about even something like redistribution of land, like there are competing land claims in several places. The Métis territory infringes on other indigenous nations, for example, and so we have to sit down unencumbered by the settler state to discuss those issues and talk about how we're going to live together or separately and establish national borders. I think, if I could look forward into the future and see what I want to see, it would be separate national entities that have working political relationships with each other. So perhaps a federation. But again, this is my opinion and not necessarily reflective of reality or what's possible. But I think independence first, and then working towards building a myriad of different social societies depending on the needs of that particular nation, and then having all of those socialist societies have relationships with each other, internationalist relationships with each other, I think is the vague end goal that I have in my mind.
That's a really hard idea to come up with right now, because I can't see the future and I don't know anybody that can see the future. The most we can say is if this is a real revolution and we're really moving forward towards communism, then Canada as Canada will no longer exist anymore. Colonization will no longer exist anymore, and we'll be building that new world. We can't just I can't just sit here and show you what a new map would look like and what the borders would look like and what would exist and what wouldn't exist, if what the names of the places would be. Right now, that's really impossible to be able to know. What we do know is that negotiation with each other and be able to respect the complete and full self-determination of all the colonized nations and peoples here, to see what is going to happen, what they want, is something that is going to have to take place and is going to take place during our revolutionary struggles. What that turns out to be and what it looks like afterwards is not really something it's not really something that can be known, I don't think. For land redistribution, Indigenous nations need to be given back a lot more of the land so they can really build up the way that they want to be able to do and have their self-determination and national liberation. They need to be able to have resources and land to be able to do these kinds of things. So that's going to have to be worked out. There's sacred sites and very culturally important and significant sites that are all around that are going to have to be given back to the nations and peoples that those are significant to. So that's also going to be have to be taken into account. But as this is what it's going to look like, I don't think it's something that we can say until the process is done.
So in terms of, you kind of touched on this, idea of, this connection between like being Indigenous and proletarian. So to add to that dynamic in terms of like being a woman, like how would you say that this idea of proletarian feminism is connected to those struggles as an Indigenous woman, and what's the solution? I guess.
Gosh. Yeah, so I mean, again, so looking at class or like Indigenous identity as like aspects of each other, I think okay. So the reason I'm a proletarian feminist and not just a feminist or an intersectional feminist, even though I take an intersectional approach to things, or Marxist approach to things, is because, yeah, I am proletarian. I'm probably going to be proletarian for the rest of my life. And the women who are most precarious in our current social formation are proletarian women. Again, this is compounded if you have a proletarian woman who is Indigenous or a woman of color, for example. We're more likely to be the victims of sexual violence, sexual harassment. We're more likely to be forced into precarious working situations, whether this means like working under the table, working dangerous jobs in factories or, in the resource extraction industry. This could also mean the sex work industry. And there's also, police abuse. I could go on and on. But these are also the points at which there is an intersection between the experiences of Indigenous women and proletarian settler women. They're the issues that affect, again, the hardcore of the proletariat, and the hardcore of the proletariat is overwhelmingly Indigenous, racialized, etc. I think when we talk about proletarian feminism, for me, it's implicit that it's Indigenous women that we're talking about. It's implicit that it's women of color that we're talking about. It's implicit that it's trans women that we're talking about, or gender non-conforming people, gender oppressed people. In terms of solutions, I think Marxism has an unfortunate history of pushing the woman question to the sideline. I think in some instances, not all, this can also be said of the national question or the question of culture. And I think that proletarian feminism does a very good job of bringing both of those things to the foreground and understanding them as necessary components of a revolutionary program, because these are the populations that make up the hardcore of the proletariat. So when we're talking about a revolution, we're not talking about, the idealized, wet dream of a Trotskyist, where it's like all white men, striking a picket line outside the factory. Like, no, we're talking about a picket line of women and gender oppressed people and indigenous people and racialized people taking militant action together, and a revolution just is impossible without those populations. When we talk about the people who are going to be most sympathetic to a revolutionary program in Canada, it's those populations. And this is not to say that white settlers are not going to have a role to play, or that those people don't understand those problems, but for the most part, their social position does not predispose them to these ideas, mm-hmm. right? They're not readily available to them in the same way that when you're working a shitty job or you're being harassed daily, that those things are in the foreground of your mind constantly.
So it's like basically they benefit more from the system in certain ways.
Yeah. I find it interesting too when I talk to women in particular. I find a lot of women either come to the revolutionary movement very late or very early, and I think it has to do with a couple things. And one is that I think when those of us who come to the movement very early, so I've been a communist for almost a decade now, working in the movement, but I've sympathized with those ideas for a very, very long time, even into my early life. It's because there are issues in your personal life that you found a solution for, or a way to overcome with politics or from a political perspective, even if it wasn't fully developed at the time, right? Because we're always developing. And then with the women who come to it late, it's not that the ideas weren't there to begin with, it's that the space in the movement or the ability to feel like you can do something about it wasn't there. And so, I don't know, it seems like emphasizing proletarian feminism and emphasizing that these people are indispensable to the class struggle is really where it's at,
For me, some of the big takeaways from talking to Alex and Brandon were that settler colonialism is truly a fundamental characteristic to understanding the activity of the state we refer to as Canada. Not only that, but the reality is that there can be absolutely no real revolution in Canada unless it directly involves the self-determination of the Indigenous nations that are currently being occupied and oppressed by the Canadian state. Therefore, any Marxist or other movement that claims to adhere to revolutionary thought while still considering Canada to be legitimate, whether implicitly or explicitly, can never be a truly revolutionary party or movement. Or if they deny Indigenous people the right to reach self-determination on their own accord. As a supporter of the PCR-RCP, I think that they fill the void, but there's certainly still a super long way to go and a lot to learn overall when it comes to organizing in the center of capitalism. Alright, so that's basically episode 2 of En Masse with our guests Alex and Brandon. Thank you for listening, and if you have any comments about this episode or ideas for future episodes, feel free to let me know through whatever social platform suits you. If you want to follow En Masse, you can go to enmasspodcast.com, which is onmasspodcast.com, or you can find me at Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud, or Instagram with the handle En Masse Podcast. My name is Mubarak, and this is En Masse. See you next time.